Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good whatever time of day it is. Thank you for tuning in to Conversations with Dr. Don. And for you viewers in other parts of the country, Conversations with Dr. Don is produced and broadcast from the Portland, Oregon area. And for your first-time viewers, Conversations with Dr. Don is an ongoing series of one-hour standalone talk shows where I interview interesting people like most of you out there, about who they are as unique, one-of-a-kind individuals, and about whatever it is we've decided to talk about. And we'll be talking about addiction in Oregon. And my guest this evening, for the umpteenth time, is Dr. Sam Metz.
Pleasure to be here, Don.
My pleasure. It's always a pleasure having you. And I find, even though you've been on 1,000 times in the past, because you've always got something new and interesting, and you never stop learning, it's one of the things I appreciate about you. But I keep trying to get a free diagnosis, and you won't give me one. You don't do head stuff, do you?
I'd have to charge you for you, Don.
Oh, yeah, I'm lost. All right. So we're going to do an abbreviated version of the Who Are You segment, because you may have some new viewers on, so I want them to know a little about you beyond what you've already given us in the past. So if you want to do a bit of a monologue, or shall I ask you some prompting questions about who you are?
I'm happy to give some background that might put a little perspective on why I'm here.
Yes, of course.
It took me a long time to get to Portland. I grew up in Phoenix, Arizona, which is still the world's largest small town. Mm-hmm. It started as a small town, and now it's much larger, but it's still a small town. Not as sophisticated as Portland, certainly doesn't have the restaurants that Portland has. I just retired as an anesthesiologist. I started out in cardiac anesthesia, and by the time I retired, I was taking care of patients for much simpler procedures so that I could go out gracefully and easily. Mm-hmm. As you know, I've been working on aspects of healthcare reform for about 8 years. And
a long time.
Yes, and as a matter of fact, the first publicity was on your show, 2010, the birthplace of Mad as Hell Doctors, a collection of healthcare advocates amongst the physician community here in Oregon. Uh-huh. Today is slightly different. I last year joined a research project for the City Club of Portland, charged with looking at addiction policy in Oregon. Now, I'm an anesthesiologist. I've administered more addictive drugs than most people will ever see in a lifetime, but it's always been in someone else. And I was really very ignorant of what it meant, what these drugs might mean when they're used outside the hospital for either recreational use or despair. So for the last year, I've had a very intensive course in learning about various aspects of addiction, and especially what they mean here in Oregon.
Various aspects of addiction. I'd be curious to hear what that means.
We think now, because of the publicity, we're talking about opioids.
Yes.
In fact, alcohol is responsible for more than half of the morbidity, the mortality, the economic damage, the lost productivity, and it's been that way for decades. And we think of addiction as a problem of somebody else. It's these people on the street who don't know any better. It's the moral failure. It's the social dregs. But it's not. It extends to every strata: alcohol, opioids of various kinds, cocaine, methamphetamine. They're all around us.
How about cannabis? Are you included in what you're talking about now, addictions?
We could. We could also talk about tobacco. What I think we should be talking about are the drugs that we know that cause the most damage.
Yes.
And the ones that are that tear families apart. Addiction is not a moral failing. It is a chronic medical condition with genetic contributions, physiologic contributions, childhood contributions, social contributions. Once someone has a substance use disorder or discovers that they have one, it can't be cured.
Substance use disorder.
It's the broad medical term. The word addiction sort of leads to the word addict, and it has an unpleasant connotation. We don't think about someone in our family whose life is driven by alcohol or has a drinking problem. We don't tend to call them addicts.
I've been through those stages many years ago and made it through.
Good for you.
I hear you.
It's a condition that can be controlled. Needs a lifetime of control. Who becomes addicted? It's the confluence of adverse childhood experiences.
Mm-hmm.
The worse your childhood is, divorce, abandonment, hunger, housing, poor education, family discord, abuse.
Those are all contributing factors.
Yes, and the more factors there are, the more likelihood the addiction.
Okay.
Plus, the earlier the exposure to any addictive substance, the more likely you are to stay addicted and resist treatment. When we look at people who have addiction problems in Oregon, most of them report their first exposure to the substance, first using it, whatever it is, alcohol, opioids, amphetamines, any drug of abuse.
Is there a genetic contribution?
Yes.
Really?
There are family histories and sometimes even ethnic histories that we suspect are at work. So if your parents had alcohol problems and your grandparents had alcohol problems, there's a good chance that you will too, and you should be very cautious.
And it may not be just social or familial stuff beyond genetics.
You're right.
Like some Indians can't go near alcohol, and some Asians, I understand.
Oh, there are people who have allergies to alcohol. That is, when they metabolize it, they become physically sick.
Okay.
That's a slightly different condition. These people are not going to become addicted to alcohol, but they still may have a predisposition to becoming addicted to something.
Okay.
Most of the people with addictions were first exposed before the age of 18. It's pretty dramatic. Age of first exposure is a prime determinant of whether you're going to continue having the problem and how well you're going to respond to therapy. And the therapy isn't a one-time tap of the magic wand. It has to go on for a lifetime. When somebody has high blood pressure, we don't give them pills, say you're cured, and send them off. It's going to require monitoring for a lifetime. It can be controlled for a lifetime, but it's always going to need attention.
But the contributing factors have a different influence depending on the person.
You're right. There are many people who are absolutely resilient. Whatever the stress is, they're not predisposed to addiction. They're not reacting dysfunctionally to all of the stress that they have. Most of us can drink alcohol socially and not have a problem.
My oldest brother died and the 12th child, of chronic alcoholism. It killed him. And I went through that stage in my teens where I was drinking too much, and even in the earlier stages of my first marriage where I was still a little kid trying to grow up and drinking too much, but not missing work. So I had those tendencies that I outgrew or left behind.
Yes.
But it wasn't as bad as Carl was.
You were lucky to be exposed to alcohol at a young age in your teens, and then to follow it up with a stressful family experience like a first marriage as opposed to your last marriage.
Yes.
That's a setup for finding some addictive substance to provide comfort.
Yeah.
You mentioned the death in your family. The United States, for the first time, has seen a decrease in life expectancy, and a dramatic decrease in life expectancy amongst rural, middle-aged, working class whites.
How long has this been going on?
About 2 years was when it was detected. And what's killing these people is suicide, alcoholism, opioids.
Okay.
These are all signs of despair.
That's beyond depression, despair.
Yes. We're seeing, now this has been going on for decades in minority populations.
Mm-hmm.
Probably what brought it to the attention of the people who write headlines was we've discovered that it's also a white disease, not just communities of color, not just the lower classes.
We only saw that part because of what the media did at publicizing these to prove that there's something deficient in those communities beyond the white community.
That these are broken communities. What we didn't realize is we have broken families throughout our population.
Sure.
The 2 out of 3 Oregonians knows someone, a family or close friend, who has a substance use disorder or has one themselves. That's how ubiquitous this is. Only 1 out of 10 people who has an addiction problem ever even seeks treatment, mostly because there's so much social stigma associated with it.
So that's the reason the information, the accurate information about the reality isn't available because of the social stigma, and no one will say, hey, I'm an alcoholic, for example.
Enough people do, but most of the people with a substance use disorder, be it opioids or alcohol, aren't going to tell somebody about it.
Yeah.
As a physician, I'm embarrassed to say that we physicians have contributed specifically to the opioid epidemic.
Yeah.
We had no idea we were doing so.
Yeah.
We've been treating chronic pain with opioids. It's no good for treating chronic pain. What we do is we convert somebody with chronic pain into somebody with chronic pain in an opioid addiction. There are 100 opioid pills in Oregon per person, legally prescribed to somebody. And most of the people who are taking opioids are taking somebody else's opioids. And what we've discovered is the epidemic of heroin that we see.
Mm-hmm.
Most of these people who are injecting heroin started out taking pills, but went to heroin because it was cheaper.
Mm-hmm.
And most of the people who started taking pills originally had it legally prescribed.
Mm-hmm. Is the pharmaceutical industry complicit in this?
Yes, it's not it's not a particularly productive conversation to have, because yes, the pharmaceutical industry, Purdue manufactured OxyContin a couple decades ago, and it was marketed probably with the full belief of everyone who was selling it as a non-addictive opioid. Well, you can't have a non-addictive opioid.
It's oxymoron.
Yes. And we physicians were persuaded to prescribe these opioids freely. Now, what we find is that people who have addiction problems don't get the treatment they need. They don't get the treatment they need because there's stigma associated with seeking treatment, because very little treatment is available, and because it requires sustained treatment. Going through detox and then being returned to the same environment is not going to produce much success.
Sam, can we back up for a second?
Yes.
Define addiction for those of us. Some of us are not even too sophisticated in that regard. If I'm addicted to something, what's wrong with me? Or what is it going on? What causes an addiction? Or what is an addiction? Let me stop talking here.
Behaviorally,
okay.
When we seek out this drug, whether it's legal or illegal, and it runs our life, we forsake friends, family, career. We compromise the rest of our life that might be more meaningful to get that drug. You've got a substance use disorder. How do you get there? It's sort of the combination of many different factors. Homelessness, racism, lack of health care, lack of education, adverse childhood circumstances, current stress, the people you live with, the people you socialize with, inability to get a job, general despair, all of these factors play into addiction.
And if I am addicted to an opioid, then none of the other substances that might cause an addiction play into it, because my primary interest in alleviating my distress or distress is through the opioid, which I've been introduced to by the pharmaceutical industry and the medical profession.
Yes, it's a little mixed, because
yes, of course.
If I have a craving for alcohol, another drug isn't going to satisfy it.
Yeah.
And if I have an addiction to opioids, other drugs won't satisfy it. Same with cocaine, methamphetamine. However, the core need to seek out an addictive substance is there. And most of the people who that we see in treatment for addiction are addicted to multiple drugs. There's the mind-altering aspect of the drug. One of the amazing interviews that we had in this research committee was with a clinician who took care of youth on the street. Now, my naive prejudice was people around the street are there because addiction destroyed their lives. But a good part of it goes the other way. People become homeless, either because they've been thrown out of their homes or they just don't have any place to go. It's their last resort. And this clinician said, if you knew you were going to spend every night for the next month on a sidewalk, you might be thinking about how you're going to get through those cold nights. And are you going to take downers so that you can forget your troubles? Or are you going to take uppers so that you don't fall into despair over your fate? Sometimes the addiction is a reaction to the homelessness rather than the other way around.
Sure.
The getting these, the first step is the people with substance use disorder isn't just to get them into medical treatment. It's to get them into a situation where all of that outside stress has somehow been relieved, or we teach them how to deal with it. Oregon has an unusually rich experience in social experiments like this. It was data from Multnomah County showed if you take homeless people, even those with addiction, and all you do is give them a home, a place to stay, a regular place to stay, their medical costs go down. The Medicaid costs go down. Which means that just having one of these insecurities, where am I going to sleep tonight, having that relieved can generate an extraordinary amount of relief and ability to control the situation that drives people to seek out addictive drugs. We could say that addiction is the price we pay for neglecting our children. Most of these, as I mentioned, most people with an addiction problem, have childhood contributors to it.
Yes.
You know, every now and then there's somebody who staves off their first exposure to an adult, and then they discover that they have an addiction problem. But most people with addiction, that starts in childhood. We should be focusing not on how can we clamp down on illicit drugs.
Clamp down, that's a dangerous thing to say.
You know, there's this unpleasant concept of a war on drugs.
Oh my God.
That's kind of a violent metaphor for people who have already been exposed to enough violence in their life. And what they need is not a war, what they need is peace. We shouldn't be focusing on cutting back on the heroin trade. We should be focusing on the social situations that drive people to seek out drugs of any kind in the first place.
For relief of the distress they're under.
Yes. Another amazing interview was with a behavioral psychologist. He talked about return on investment in schools. That is, if we spend money on a certain project in school, we can reduce that child's future addiction problem, medical needs. There's something called the good behavior game in the first grade. Doesn't say anything about drugs. It's an exercise in how kids can deal with everyday stress, how they can be more functional, how they can get their needs met a little bit better. For every dollar invested in this first grade class, and I just use that as an example of taking care of children,
Sure.
the downstream costs are avoided are about 60 to 1. That's money that we don't spend on the destructive, trying to retrieve them from addiction, or to keep them, or to put them into prison, or because they can't find a job, or giving them social services. Investing in children now is the best way to improve our community's addiction problem in 10 years.
I got a provocative question for you, I think.
It's the only kind you asked.
In American culture, in the kind of capitalism practiced in America, it shows a deficiency in the kind of capitalism we practice in our country. such that we probably have a greater incidence of addiction than some of the socialist kinds of systems that exist in Northern Europe, for example. You have any data on the likelihood of a person being addicted in those countries versus what's going on in America?
It is a good question. I don't know. I can't tell you what's going on in Europe, for example. In the United States and in Oregon, the percentage of the population that has a substance use disorder of some kind that's adversely affecting them is about 10%, 1 out of 10. That's a very high number.
Of course.
The majority of those are alcohol. Now, there is some cultural response to alcohol. The alcohol abuse tends to be less in the sophisticated centers of Central Europe, where alcohol is
freely.
It's a different attitude. On the other hand, the American tobacco smoking rate is about the lowest in the world. Europe is probably close to 30%. In the U.S., it's 20%, and is even dropping. So I don't know that there's a difference in susceptibility or cultural addiction problems. I think each one of these drugs that we're talking about, drugs of abuse, has a different history in different countries. You are correct that American capitalism in the form of organized crime or disorganized crime certainly takes advantage of the market that we physicians have created for opioids.
You're going into politics again, talking about organized crime. Never mind, cancel that. You can nail me anytime you want to, Sam. Okay.
There are programs in Europe that appear to be successful for dealing with their opioid problems that maybe we should think about. One is safe injection sites.
Yes.
It's being tried in several countries. It's being tried in Vancouver, and we might be trying it here. There's defelonization of possession of small amounts of narcotics. Trying to make a difference between the person who's using the drugs and the person who's in the business of it. Probably a poor distinction, because most people who are using opioids illegally have to sell them in order to support their own habit.
Yeah.
There's a lot of thought, including here in Multnomah County, about the first interaction that somebody in law enforcement has with someone who is showing that they're under the influence of illicit drugs. There's a program to bypass criminal justice. That is, can we get you to help now? Can we get you into a program that will deal with your drug addiction without you having to go to jail and go through the courts and then maybe get treatment? Where we intervene in drug addiction is a balance between effectiveness, drama, and cost. The worst way to deal with a person's substance use disorder is when they get out of prison and see if we can get them clean in a program. That's way downstream. If we can get them into a program before they go to prison and bypass prison, that's even better. If we can provide them with help when their lives first start getting shaky, and as soon as they get exposed to the drug and they see they have a problem, if we can give them help there, even more effective.
Isn't there an earlier intervention than what we're talking about now?
Yes. Ultimately, the best intervention is to raise healthier kids. if we are going to invest a lot of money in preventing tomorrow's addiction problem, it will be support for families with children.
Isn't sugar, refined sugar, shouldn't that be classified as an addictive substance or like a drug in that what it does to so many people, such that they have organ failures and those kinds of things, directly attributable to it's a substance that they ingest.
It's certainly a health hazard. What we now know about nutrition is it's not the fat in our diet that causes metabolic syndrome, obesity, diabetes, hypertension, and strokes. It's processed sugar. And that's been known for a while. Thanks to the sugar industry, it hasn't been in the headlines. And if you're thinking about lives hurt, health hazards, sugar, tobacco are certainly two of the highest public health hazards. When we talk about people's lives becoming shattered, not just because of their health, but because the drug-seeking activity has destroyed their families and their friendship and their jobs and their community, then we're talking about alcohol. We're talking about opioids, methamphetamine, cocaine. These are the areas that we should focus on. We should be thinking about these.
We can probably do something about.
What we want to avoid is trying to solve all of the problems at the same time with one stroke.
Yes.
Addiction has been going on a long time. And people with substance use disorder have suffered a long time. There's no one intervention that will cure everything. But there are many smaller interventions that can be very effective. What we don't want to do is say, we'll put more drug agents on the street and make heroin harder to get, and that will solve things. It's not going to do it. Even revising physician practice, that's going to have results years from now. But right now there are people with substance use disorder. They need help. We need to provide it to them.
And you know, I'm going to interrupt what you're saying because I just had a notice from the sidelines that somebody's going to yell at me unless we take a break here.
Let's take a break.
Give
then.
people a chance to get a glass of water. So we'll take a break for a few minutes and then we'll be back in a couple of minutes and talk some more. Okay, we are back again. Thanks to you for staying tuned, and I'm so glad you did. But some of you were goofing off at the opening of the show, and I got to help you out to know what you're looking at. For your viewers who missed the opening of the show, Conversations with Dr. Don, is an ongoing series of 1-hour standalone talk shows where I interview interesting people like Sam over here, Dr. Metz, about who he is and about whatever it is we've decided to talk about tonight. We've been talking kind of all over the place, but most of all, we've been talking about addiction, and we'll be talking some more about addiction in Oregon in the broader sense of the word, and even in those aspects of addiction that we can do something about beyond what's generally available, like in Appalachia and places like that.
Thank you for the reintroduction, Don. This does tie in with my first crusade for healthcare reform.
Healthcare reform.
Americans lack reliable access to healthcare. With the job turnover, the chances of somebody staying with the same insurance benefits for the rest of their life are very small. Mm-hmm. We attempt to save money on healthcare in the United States by restricting benefits. And unhappily, the first benefits that get thrown out when people say, what shouldn't we cover, are mental health benefits and addiction benefits. Why? Because we responsible taxpayers, in our naivete, think that only irresponsible non-taxpayers have mental health problems or need addiction therapy. Consequently, even people who seek care may find that they're on their own. It's not covered. Or, what's even more common, is that the funding for addiction services, especially in Oregon, is so paltry that the people who are essentially have to volunteer their services to work at an addiction clinic. It's really pretty sad. This is one of the best ways to treat somebody with an addiction problem is to have them treated by people who have addiction problems themselves. Mm-hmm. And are under control, so they have role models.
Yes.
We don't, we tend to balk at hiring these people. We tend to think that we can save money if we just let the people with addiction take what they can get and send them on their way. And of course, every time we change insurance companies, or lose insurance, then the benefits change. There's no consistency. We further stigmatize addiction services, not by putting them in clinics where we get our cardiology consultation and our primary care, family practice. The addiction clinic is way out there, as if we don't want real people to see you with your addiction problem, further complicating health care. We have ostracized not just the people who have addiction problems, we've even ostracized the people who care for them. As one of my fellow physicians said, if we paid physicians in addiction medicine the way we pay orthopedic surgeons, our addiction problem would be much less.
Is there an empathy deficiency disorder in the American population?
It's being exacerbated by the partisan politics, but in fact this last election, I'm going to diverge for a moment.
Please.
What we have uncovered is there are millions of Americans who think that Donald Trump best represents how they feel. And how it's not what he says, it's that he's angry, he's uncompromising, he's defiant, he is unapologetic, And for people who feel like they've never had a voice before, that's the kind of voice you want. And in a way, it's a similar sort of phenomenon at the other end of the disenfranchised who seek out Bernie Sanders, who's defiant, loud, uncompromising. And what's common in both of these groups is looking for somebody to blame. And that's where the compassion fatigue comes along.
Isn't there somebody to blame, one side more than the other?
If we look for who's to blame, we're going to spend the rest of our lives pointing fingers at each other. The community doesn't need to find an enemy to blame. You more than anyone have been dramatic in asking people to have compassion, even for people here who aren't kind. The reason that we have this despair in rural America that's driving them to suicide, alcoholism, and opioids isn't that all of these communities of color are enjoying the good life, but they like to believe that somebody else is responsible for their miserable condition.
Well, isn't that true? A system, the governance?
It is a system.
There is a
affair.
blame. Let's don't.
But we don't want to fight each other here.
I'm not talking about fighting each other. I'm talking about identifying who the real culprit is, so that culprit is, so that we can do something about them.
The first thing we need to do is to recognize the community we have in others. Sure. We need to say, you have an addiction problem. You're a different color. You vote a different party. You talk to different people. But we're both being left out, and we need to work together. If the disenfranchised people of the U.S. had a productive voice, a collective voice, we could achieve enormous strides in reversing the income inequality, reversing the poverty, reversing the conditions that drive people into addiction. That's far more productive, I think. Having empathy for people you don't like and realizing that the enemy isn't beside you. The enemy is a system which is growing wildly out of control. Yes. That's going to do more for our families.
What do we do about the system that you're talking about now, or alluding to, or something?
You know, in one of our previous sessions, we talked about...
I forget about your phenomenal memory.
This weapon of mass destruction.
Mm-hmm.
We all have one of these. If we write to our elected representatives and we say, we need to fix this, I want you to fix it, and I want you to tell me how you're going to do it. Sincerely, your voting constituent. They'll pay attention. Okay, here's an imaginary congressman, legislator.
Okay.
And coming to the door is this lobbyist who says, here's a great big sack of money. I want you to take that, and I want you to keep things just the same. And the congressman said, I just got this letter that said, one of my constituents is fed up with this. Not getting health care, not getting addiction services, not getting an education. And they're going to hold me responsible for it. And it's not just one. I got 10 letters like that today, and 10 letters before that, and 10 letters the week before. And you know what? There's not enough money in here for me to convince all of my constituents that they're happy with the way things are now. So I'm happy to take my take your money. But my re-election depends upon my doing something positive, and I'm going to have to do it.
Well, your re-election, of course, is important and necessary to be re-elected as long as you are ignoring the wealth offered to me by the super rich who really run things in this country. Because the way it exists now, I need the money to get re-elected. And you are writing to me and talking to me face to face does not have the juice that the super rich who will pay for my campaigns and have me become re-elected. I'm challenging you, Sam.
You are. The chances...
I'm a socialist, as you know. You didn't know.
It shows.
Of course.
The chances of a defiant reformer winning against an incumbent are small, but they're not zero. And what makes the difference is the challenger mobilizing the votes without spending the money. Now, that's hard to do because so many people think in sound bites, and if it's not tweeted to them or it's not on television or it's not on a Facebook page, it doesn't exist. But there are others who can be reached. And if only 1 out of 10 of these newcomers who can make things happen gets elected, and that happens every 2 years, in a couple years we're going to have more representative legislators and Congress people. The percent win for the Koch brothers is not high. It's not zero. It's better than mine, contributing $50 to a campaign.
Are you suggesting that we ordinary citizens compete with the Koch brothers? I couldn't think of anything else to say to you to provoke you.
Yes.
Okay.
We can't fight on their terms.
Okay.
There's no way you and I are going to collect millions of dollars to influence a campaign. But you and I can go on the show and empower people and let them know, don't roll over and let the Koch brothers run the country.
Mm-hmm.
Become activists. Talk to your family, talk to your friends, talk to your church group. The reason that, getting a little precise here,
Sure.
the reason that Donald Trump won the election wasn't that there weren't enough people who didn't want him elected. It was that the voter turnout amongst the people who don't want him was so low. We don't need to convince our opponents that they're wrong. We just need to mobilize the people who think the way we do and tell them, vote. Turn your effort into an effect. Don't make noise. Get to the ballot. And bring 10 of your friends with you.
I agree with you, and I still got a challenger. How many more steps are we going to move toward midnight on the countdown clock before we get to the last step before the Reichstag fire?
Before there's rioting in the streets and chaos and there's revolution.
Jesus, I can't stump it. I can't. I love it. But we do what we can, huh?
The United States has had some electoral revolutions in its time without having the poor running through the streets with pitchforks and torches and burning down the missions. We have had acute reversals that nobody predicted. We saw one in the last presidential election. That is a testimony not to the takeover of the rich and wealthy. Donald Trump was not endorsed by the rich and wealthy. There were just a few, but he wasn't endorsed by any governor. He wasn't endorsed by any congressional leader, any Republican leader, any major newspaper. There were only a handful of donors who gave him any money. And he won because he could mobilize people who felt disenfranchised and helpless. And he said, if you vote for me, things will happen. There's a lesson for us. Bernie Sanders tried that. He just wasn't as good. But Bernie Sanders showed that there's as much energy, there's as much distaste for how things are, the way things are, that we could have a revolution in the next election if we can figure out a way to get these people to vote.
Wasn't as good as. Good doesn't have very much to do with it in our existing system. Because Bernie lost, it wasn't because he wasn't as good as, it was because the money was not available for him to have the media put out authentic, effective truth about the reality of what's going to be happening to what's going on now in our country, and about the opioid epidemic increasing because of people's despair. Because they can sense deep inside that what's been going on in their lives isn't really the real reason that I'm so depressed, that we need to do something about the existing system.
Hillary Clinton outspent Donald Trump 2-1.
Mm-hmm.
It's unusual. There's a lesson there.
Okay.
Ultimately, what counts in the U.S. are votes. Money is one way to recruit votes. It's an effective way. It's not the only way. If you don't have a message, but you've got a lot of money, you can still get votes. But sometimes the message counts even if you don't have money. And the message, you don't have to convince people to change their minds. You just have to mobilize people who think the way you do and turn them into a voting bloc. Bernie Sanders mobilized people to vote who probably wouldn't have thought about it.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I wished he had been better at it. And I wished we had a Democratic candidate who could appeal to, have the same kind of appeal to the disenfranchised that Bernie Sanders did. I don't know who that candidate.
That's the key, the disenfranchised.
Yes.
Yeah.
There's, on any issue, addiction, healthcare reform, education, immigration, there's a core over here of people who are adamant in one position, and then there's another core over here that's adamantly against it. And in between, it's this massive disinterest. Not disinterest because they don't care, because they feel like nobody's listening. They feel like they don't count. And rather than vote, they turn to drugs or alcohol or despair.
Yeah.
Or simple bumper stickers. Get rid of them all, build the wall. Simple bite-sized way of thinking. The people in the middle, the disenfranchised, those are the people that Donald Trump mobilized. Those were the people that Bernie Sanders mobilized. And there's still there are millions more people who didn't vote. And most of the people who didn't vote might have made a difference for us.
We only have a couple minutes left, and I want you to have the last word, whatever you want to say about anything at all, about us talking or anything else. And look at that camera and talk to the viewers. And I'll look at you.
We started out talking about addiction.
Yeah.
What we really were talking about was despair and disenfranchisement. We look at the money that's being spent in our elections and we think, I can't match that. But we do have votes, and we do have people who will listen to us if we speak to them. We can't roll over and let moneyed interest catch the ear of our elected representatives. We need to talk to our elected representatives, and maybe if you're really daring, you can become an elected representative. Keep fighting.
Excellent. Thank you so much. All right, looks like it's time for us to put up a couple of public service announcements, my favorites, of course. And to get my local broadcast schedule, go to my website, www.donbaham.com, and click on Present Day Activities. And to watch my shows on the web, Google Don Baham YouTube, and there's many, many shows on there. And my favorite of all is the American Civil Liberties Union. Go to www.aclu.org and learn more about the ACLU, because without the ACLU, our civil liberties would be further in the toilet.
It's a technical term.
My show is broadcast by other stations. Ask your local public access station to go to www.pegmedia.org and follow the instructions on how to have my shows shown in other parts of the country besides just YouTube. And to end corporate personhood, go to www.movetoamend.org. To save this wonderful experiment in democracy, we have to amend the Constitution to say that corporations are not persons and money is not speech. And thank you for watching. Remember KFC, please. Kind, friendly, and charitable. Not Kentucky Fried Chicken, Dr. Don's KFC. Kind, friendly, and charitable. Be kind, be friendly, and to be charitable to you too, and you too. Thanks again for watching. We'll be seeing you next time. And thanks, Sam.